The gymnasium lights flickered as Sarah adjusted her tiara one last time. Homecoming queen. She'd dreamed of this moment since freshman year. But as she turned toward the mirror, something was wrong. Through the reflection, she saw them first. Rotting hands clawing through the gymnasium windows, flesh hanging from bone like torn fabric. The smell hit next. Death, decay. The sickly, sweet stench of corpses left in the Texas heat too long. Then came the screams. The dead had risen in Cedar Creek, and Jefferson High's homecoming dance had become their feeding ground. Students who'd spent hours perfecting their hair and makeup were now running for their lives as decomposing corpses shambled through the decorated halls, their hollow eye sockets seeking fresh meat. What started as the night of their lives became a fight for survival against an army of the undead. This is the story of how a Texas high school's homecoming dance turned into a zombie massacre, and how a handful of teenagers discovered that sometimes the dead do not stay buried. Don't forget to subscribe to Sinister Stories and drop a comment with your favorite horror topic. We read every single one, and your suggestions fuel our next terrifying tales. Sarah Martinez had waited 4 years for this moment. The crown felt perfect as Principal Williams placed it on her head, and the gymnasium had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Fake snow, twinkling lights, and silver streamers creating magic under the disco ball. Ladies and gentlemen, your 2024 homecoming queen, Sarah Martinez. The applause was deafening. Her boyfriend Jake beamed from the crowd, his varsity jacket catching the light. Even the kids who usually ignored her were cheering. Everything was perfect. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Students laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the entertainment. But Sarah felt something else. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The smell came first. Putrid, overwhelming, like roadkill left rotting in summer heat. Students near the windows started gagging, covering their noses with corsages and boutonnieres. "What is that stench?" Jake whispered, pulling Sarah closer. The answer came with a crash that shattered the gymnasium's peace. The large windows along the east wall exploded inward simultaneously, spraying glass across the dance floor like deadly confetti. Through the jagged openings came the source of the smell. The dead. They weren't sick people or drugged students. These were corpses. Actual corpses with rotting flesh hanging from yellowed bones, empty eye sockets weeping black fluid, and jaws that clicked and snapped hungrily. Some still wore the tattered remains of burial clothes, while others were naked, their skin mottled green and purple with decay. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been chaperoning near the windows, stood frozen as a decomposing thing in a moldy suit grabbed her with skeletal fingers, its jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of broken teeth before it bit down on her throat. Her scream cut through the silence, and then chaos erupted. More windows shattered. The main doors burst open. Zombies poured in from every entrance, their movements jerky but relentless. The winter wonderland became a slaughterhouse in seconds. Students trampled each other, running for exits that were already blocked by more undead. The disco ball continued spinning, casting fragments of light across scenes of pure horror. The massacre unfolded with terrifying efficiency. Tommy Chen, the quiet physics student, was cornered by 3 zombies near the punch table. They didn't just kill him. They tore him apart while he was still screaming, dividing his body like a meal between starving animals. Blood sprayed across the white decorations, turning the winter theme into something from a nightmare. The fake snow was now stained crimson, and silver streamers dripped with gore. Sarah watched Jessica from the cheerleading squad get dragged down by a zombie child. A little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. Her pink dress rotted through, revealing ribs that showed through decomposed skin. The thing that had once been a child buried its face in Jessica's stomach, feeding with wet, horrible sounds. "The cemetery!" Marcus Webb shouted over the screams. He was pressed against the wall near the emergency exit, his debate team medal bouncing as he fought off a zombie teacher whose face was half missing. "They're coming from Cedar Creek Cemetery." Of course, Jefferson High had been built right next to the old cemetery, the one that dated back to the 1800s. Students had always joked about it being haunted, never imagining that one day the dead would actually rise. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, yanking her toward Marcus. "We have to move, now." They fought through the panicking crowd, stepping over bodies that were either dead or feeding. Sarah's homecoming dress tore as desperate hands grabbed at her, using her for leverage in their own escape attempts. A zombie football player, his uniform still visible under rotting flesh, tackled 3 fleeing students near the exit. His helmet was cracked, revealing skull underneath, but his tackle form was perfect as he brought them down. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so horrific. The emergency exit alarm was drowned out by screams, but Marcus had managed to prop it open. Through the doorway, Sarah could see the parking lot was just as bad. Abandoned cars sat with doors flung wide, their owners either fled or feeding the growing horde. "There's too many of them," Jake gasped, looking at the shambling figures filling the lot. Some were fresh corpses recently buried, while others looked ancient, skeletal remains held together by scraps of leathery skin. "The school," Sarah decided. "We go deeper into the school, find somewhere to hide until help comes." But looking at the sea of undead streaming from the cemetery, Sarah wondered if help was even possible. How do you fight an enemy that's already dead? The hallways of Jefferson High had become a maze of horror. Zombies wandered aimlessly, drawn by sound and movement, their rotting feet leaving dark stains on the polished floors. Some were recent additions to the undead army, students and teachers from the dance, their formal wear now torn and bloodied. Others were clearly from the cemetery, their burial clothes hanging in tatters. Sarah, Jake, and Marcus moved carefully through the chaos, staying close to the walls and avoiding the main corridors. The sounds were everywhere, wet feeding noises, the scrape of bone on tile, and occasionally the desperate screams of survivors who hadn't been as lucky. They found temporary refuge in Mrs. Patterson's calculus classroom, barricading the door with desks. Through the small window, they could see the full scope of the nightmare. The cemetery next to the school was completely empty, every grave split open like ugly wounds in the earth. "Look at that," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the graveyard. In the moonlight, they could see more figures still emerging from the ground, skeletal hands pushing through dirt, decomposed heads breaking the surface. "They're still coming." A zombie in a prom dress from decades past shuffled by their window. Half her face was gone, revealing skull and empty socket, but she still wore a corsage that had long since withered to black stems. "The whole cemetery," Jake said in disbelief. "Every single grave." That's when they heard it, a voice over the school's PA system. Principal Williams, somehow still alive, broadcasting from his office. "All remaining students and staff, the authorities have been contacted. Military assistance is en route. Find secure locations and wait for extraction. Do not attempt to leave the building. Repeat, do not leave the building." But even as he spoke, they could hear zombies in the background of his transmission, their groans and shuffling feet growing louder. The broadcast cut to static, then silence. Sarah pressed her face against the cool glass of the window. In the distance, she could see Cedar Creek's main street. Cars were overturned, buildings had broken windows, and bodies lay scattered everywhere. This wasn't just about their school anymore. The dead had risen in Cedar Creek, and the living were becoming an endangered species. The calculus classroom felt like a tomb. Sarah, Jake, and Marcus huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the undead shuffling through the hallways. Every scrape of rotting feet on tile, every wet groan reminded them that death was just outside their barricaded door. "How many do you think are out there?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus had been keeping count through the window. "I've seen at least 50 different ones pass by, and that's just in this hallway. 50 zombies from one small section of Cedar Creek Cemetery." Sarah tried not to think about how many graves were in the entire graveyard. Hundreds, maybe thousands, dating back to the town's founding. All of them now empty, their former occupants hunting for living flesh. A soft scratching sound made them freeze. Something was at the door, fingernails or bone scraping against wood. The zombie didn't seem to know they were inside, just mindlessly clawing at the surface. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped, and they heard wet footsteps moving away. "We can't stay here forever," Sarah said, though the thought of leaving their sanctuary terrified her. Through the window she could see more zombies emerging from the cemetery. The flow seemed endless. That's when Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through Mrs. Patterson's desk for anything useful, he found an old yearbook from 1987. The pages were yellowed with age, but one photo made his blood run cold. "Look at this," he whispered, showing them a picture of the cemetery's dedication ceremony. Cedar Creek Cemetery, established 1847, built on sacred Native American burial ground. The town council ignored warnings from local tribes about disturbing the land. Sarah stared at the photo. Even in black and white, there was something ominous about the ceremony. The town officials looked uncomfortable, and in the background she could see Native American protesters holding signs. "Cursed ground," Jake said, understanding immediately. "The dead can't rest because the land itself is wrong." A loud crash echoed through the building, followed by screams. Other survivors were still fighting for their lives somewhere in the school, but the sounds were getting fewer and farther between. The zombies were winning. The scream that shattered their planning came from nearby, the chemistry lab across the hall. Through their window they could see Amanda Morrison, a sophomore, trapped as 3 zombies cornered her. One was a decomposed Civil War soldier, his blue uniform barely recognizable under centuries of decay. Another was a more recent corpse, Mr. Davidson, the math teacher, his tie still knotted despite his throat being completely torn away. "We have to help her," Sarah said, moving toward their barricade. "Are you insane?" Jake grabbed her arm. "If we open that door, we're dead." But Sarah was already pushing desks aside. Amanda had helped with her homecoming campaign, had always been kind to everyone. She couldn't watch a 15-year-old girl get torn apart by the undead. The rescue was brief, but successful. Sarah threw open the door, grabbed Amanda, and dragged her into their classroom before the zombies realized their prey had vanished. The 3 undead creatures continued clawing at the chemistry lab's empty air, their rotted brains unable to process that their meal had disappeared. Amanda was in shock, covered in blood that thankfully wasn't her own. "They ate Mr. Davidson alive," she whispered. "Just tore pieces off him while he was still screaming. And then he got back up and started hunting with them." The 4 survivors rebuilt their barricade, but they all knew they couldn't stay hidden much longer. The zombies were getting smarter, more coordinated. Some still retained fragments of their human intelligence, enough to open doors and use simple tools. "There's something else," Amanda said, her voice shaking. "I was hiding in the principal's office when it started. I heard him on the phone with someone before the zombies got him. He kept saying, 'The experiment worked too well and we can't contain it anymore.'" Marcus looked up from the yearbook. "Experiment?" "There's a research facility beneath the cemetery," Amanda continued. "My dad worked there. They were trying to find a way to preserve tissue indefinitely, reverse cellular death. But something went wrong last night. Really wrong. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The zombie outbreak wasn't natural or supernatural. It was science gone catastrophically wrong. And if the research facility was still active beneath the cemetery, it meant the nightmare might be spreading far beyond Cedar Creek." Dawn brought no relief. Through the classroom windows, they could see the full scope of the devastation. Cedar Creek looked like a war zone. Overturned cars, smashed storefronts, and bodies scattered everywhere. Some of the bodies were getting back up. The zombie horde had grown throughout the night. The original cemetery corpses had been joined by fresh victims from the town, creating an army of the undead that shambled through the streets in search of living flesh. "Military's coming," Jake said, pointing toward the horizon where helicopters appeared like black insects against the dawn sky. But as they got closer, the survivors realized with growing horror that the helicopters weren't coming to rescue anyone. They were coming to destroy everything. "Containment protocol," Marcus said grimly, understanding the military's plan. "They're going to sterilize the entire area." The first missile hit the research facility beneath the cemetery, sending a pillar of fire into the sky. The explosion shook the school so hard that windows cracked and ceiling tiles fell. But instead of stopping the zombies, the destruction seemed to energize them. The undead began moving with purpose, streaming toward the school like a flood of rotting flesh and bone. They could sense the living survivors inside, and nothing would stop them from feeding. "The basement," Amanda said suddenly. "There's an old tunnel system that connects to the storm drains. My grandfather helped build them during the Cold War. It was their only chance." As zombies poured into Jefferson High from every entrance, the 4 teenagers fought their way through corridors filled with the undead. Sarah's homecoming crown was long gone, replaced by a fire axe she'd grabbed from an emergency case. They reached the basement as the building shook from another military strike. Behind them, they could hear hundreds of zombies flooding the upper floors, their hungry moans echoing through the stairwells. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and led away from Cedar Creek. As they crawled through the darkness, Sarah looked back one last time at the town where she'd grown up. Fire consumed everything, but she could still see the shambling silhouettes of the undead, persistent even in the flames. Some nightmares, she realized, never truly end. Sarah, Jake, Marcus, and Amanda emerged from the storm drain 3 miles outside Cedar Creek as the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky. Behind them, black smoke rose from what had once been their hometown. The military had done their job. Cedar Creek was gone, erased from the map along with its zombie infestation. But as they walked along the empty highway, bloody and traumatized, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Amanda's father had worked for a research company, not a local lab. If they had facilities in Cedar Creek, how many other small towns across America were hosting similar experiments? The 4 survivors were found by a National Guard patrol 6 hours later. They were debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and relocated with new identities. Officially, Cedar Creek had been destroyed by a gas explosion. The truth was classified at the highest levels. Sarah never wore a crown again. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the rotting faces of the undead, could still smell the stench of decay that had filled Jefferson High's gymnasium. The night that was supposed to be the most magical of her life had become a waking nightmare that would haunt her forever. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered about the other research facilities. She wondered if somewhere else, in another small town, another homecoming queen was adjusting her tiara while the dead prepared to rise. Because in a world where science can resurrect the dead, no one is ever truly safe from the nightmare that lurks beneath the ground. The Cedar Creek incident remains classified, but stories like Sarah's remind us that horror can strike anywhere, anytime. What started as a perfect homecoming night became a fight for survival against an enemy that should have stayed buried. If this tale of teenage terror and zombie horror gave you chills, you're exactly where you belong. Here at Sinister Stories, we dig deep into the darkest corners of horror, from supernatural scares to scientific nightmares gone wrong. Drop a comment below and tell us, what's your favorite type of horror story? Zombies? Ghosts? Something even more terrifying? We read every single comment and use your suggestions to craft our next spine-tingling tales. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because trust me, you don't want to miss what we have planned next. The dead may rest in Cedar Creek, but here at Sinister Stories, the horror never sleeps. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them after tonight's story.